The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Copper Ridge General Store, dust billowing up from the wheels like smoke from a dying fire. The driver climbed down, his boots hitting the packed earth with a sound that echoed in the afternoon stillness. He moved to the back of the coach and began unloading mail sacks, parcels wrapped in brown paper, a crate of chickens that clucked and complained about their journey. Then he opened the passenger door. The woman who emerged moved slowly, one hand gripping the door frame, the other pressed against the swell of her belly. 6 months along, the kind of pregnant that could not be hidden under any amount of fabric. Her dress was faded calico, mended so many times the original color was nearly lost beneath the patches. Her boots were worn through at the toes. Her face was pale, not from the Arizona sun that blazed overhead, but from something deeper, something that lived behind her eyes like a wound that would not heal. Marlo Ashton stepped down onto the street of Copper Ridge and felt every eye in town turn toward her. She was 26 years old. She had traveled 300 miles in the back of that stagecoach, sitting upright for every jarring mile because there was no room to lie down, no comfort to be found. Her back ached with a persistence that made her teeth clench. Her feet were swollen inside boots that no longer fit properly. The baby kicked against her ribs, restless and strong, reminding her that she was not alone, would never be alone again, even if the whole world turned its back. The driver handed down her single carpet bag. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it. 2 dresses, both faded. A shawl that had belonged to her mother. A hairbrush with half the bristles missing. And a wooden spoon, worn smooth by years of use, that she had carried all this way because it was the only thing she had left of the life she used to know. She took the bag and thanked the driver. He tipped his hat but did not meet her eyes, already turning away as if her condition might be catching. The stagecoach pulled away toward the livery stable, leaving Marlo alone in the dust with her carpet bag and her unborn child, and the weight of judgment settling over her shoulders like a yoke she could not shake. Copper Ridge was not a large town. 2 streets intersecting at right angles. The general store with its false front and hand-painted sign. A boarding house with white curtains in the windows that spoke of respectability and rules. A church with a bell tower that cast a long shadow in the afternoon light. A saloon. A smithy. The usual collection of buildings that spring up wherever people gather to carve civilization out of wilderness. But it was a town that remembered. Small towns always remembered. A woman in a green dress stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, her daughter beside her. When she saw Marlo's condition, she pulled the girl close and turned the child's face away, as if pregnancy outside marriage were a contagion that could spread through sight alone. 2 men sat on a bench outside the saloon. One of them said something Marlo could not hear. The other laughed, a sound that carried across the street, sharp and ugly as broken glass. Marlo lifted her chin and walked toward the boarding house. The sign above the door read Bradford House in faded gold lettering. The windows were clean, the porch swept, the whole building radiating an air of propriety that made Marlo's stomach tighten with hope and dread in equal measure. She climbed the steps, feeling the baby shift with each movement, and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was tall and thin, dressed in black silk that whispered when she moved. Her hair was iron gray, pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, and just as cold. Mrs. Constance Bradford, owner and proprietor, widow of a copper mine foreman who had died in a cave-in 15 years prior, leaving her with a house and a small pension and a certainty that she was better than most people in Copper Ridge. She looked at Marlowe, at the carpetbag, at the swell of her belly that could not be hidden, would not be denied. Her mouth thinned to a line as sharp as a knife blade. Before Marlowe could speak, before she could ask about a room or a price or how long she might stay, Mrs. Bradford said, "We don't house women of your kind here." The words hung in the air between them, loud enough for the street to hear. Marlowe felt her face grow hot. "Ma'am, I can pay. I just need—" "I run a respectable establishment." Mrs. Bradford's voice carried across the porch, across the street, to the ears of everyone within hearing distance. And in a town like Copper Ridge, that meant everyone. "I won't have my boarders subjected to the presence of a woman who has no husband, no family, and no shame." Shame. The word struck like a fist to the gut. Marlowe had felt it before, had worn it like a cloak for the past 3 months, ever since her husband Ben had died of cholera in a Kansas quarantine camp, and his family had looked at her swelling belly and decided the child could not possibly be his. No proof, no evidence, just suspicion and the cruel mathematics of grief looking for someone to blame. They had sent her away with nothing, told her never to come back, told her she was lucky they did not have her arrested for adultery and fraud. Lucky. Marlowe stood on the porch of Bradford House and felt the baby move inside her, a rolling kick that said, "I am here, I am real, I matter." She thought of all the things she could say, all the defenses she could mount, all the ways she could plead her case and beg for mercy. Instead, she said quietly, "I understand, ma'am. Thank you for your time." She turned and descended the steps, spine straight, head high. Behind her, Mrs. Bradford called out, loud enough for the entire street to hear, "The stagecoach leaves in 3 days, headed back east. I suggest you be on it." Marlowe did not look back. She walked down the main street of Copper Ridge with her carpetbag in one hand and her dignity wrapped around her like armor, even though her vision blurred and her chest felt like it was caving in. She passed the general store, where the proprietor stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. She met his eyes. He looked away first. She passed the church. The door was open, and she could see the preacher inside, arranging hymnals on the pews. She thought about going in, about asking for help, for guidance, for the charity that churches were supposed to offer to the poor and downtrodden. But she had been to churches before, had sat in pews and sung hymns and listened to sermons about mercy and forgiveness. And when her own moment of need had come, when she had gone to the minister of her husband's church and asked for help, he had told her to pray for forgiveness and then shown her the door. She kept walking. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land and the desert stretched out toward distant mesas, she found a stand of cottonwoods growing along a creek. The water was low this time of year, just a trickle over smooth stones, but it was clean and cold, and the trees provided shade from the brutal afternoon sun. She knelt on the bank and splashed her face, drank handful after handful, until the dust of the road was washed from her throat and she could breathe again without tasting despair. Then she sat beneath the largest tree and allowed herself, for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, to cry. She cried for her husband, dead at 28, from a disease that had swept through the quarantine camp like wildfire. She cried for the child growing inside her, who would never know its father, would carry the weight of illegitimacy, whether it was true or not. She cried for the home she had lost, the life she had imagined, the future that had been stolen by circumstance and cruelty. But she did not cry for long. Marlo Ashton had learned early in life that tears solved nothing. She had been 11 when her mother died of consumption, leaving 4 children behind. 12 when her father disappeared, leaving her and her 3 younger siblings in a boarding house in St. Louis, with 2 months' rent paid and a note that said he would be back soon. He never came back. Marlo had raised those children herself, working as a scullery maid in a hotel kitchen, learning to cook because it was the only skill that paid enough to keep them fed, learning to make something out of nothing, learning that survival required more than hope. It required stubbornness. She wiped her eyes with the hem of her dress, stood, and looked around with clearer vision. The cottonwoods were old, their bark rough and scarred from decades of desert weather. The creek bed was lined with smooth stones and wild grasses that whispered in the afternoon breeze. 50 yards downstream, she could see a fence line, posts and rails that marked the boundary of someone's property. Beyond the fence, the land stretched out toward distant mesas, brown and gold in the slanting light. This would do. Marlo had $17.32 sewn into the lining of her dress. She had 3 days before the stagecoach left. She had a baby coming in 10 weeks, maybe 12 if fortune smiled. And she had learned, through years of hard necessity, that you do not beg for what you can earn. She opened her carpetbag and took out the wooden spoon. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Marlo had spent $2.47 at the general store. Flour, salt, lard, a small bag of dried beans, 3 carrots that were starting to wrinkle, an onion, a cut of beef that the proprietor had sold her at a steep discount, probably because it was a day past prime and he wanted it gone before it turned. He had not asked questions, had taken her money without comment, though his eyes had lingered on her belly with an expression she could not quite read. When she turned to leave, packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, he had said, "You got somewhere to stay, ma'am?" She had hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir, I do." It was not precisely a lie. She had somewhere. It just was not what most people would call shelter. She carried her parcels back to the cottonwoods and set about making camp. She had no tent, no bedroll, no proper equipment for living rough. But she had the shawl from her carpetbag, and she found enough deadfall wood to build a small fire. And when the sun set and the temperature dropped, she wrapped herself in the shawl and sat close to the flames, and felt grateful that it was autumn in Arizona and not winter in Kansas. She built a tripod from green branches and hung her dented cooking pot over the fire, filled it with water from the creek. While the water heated, she cut the beef into small pieces, trimmed away the fat with the care of someone who had spent years in kitchens and knew that good food required attention to detail. She browned the meat in the lard, the smell rich and savory in the evening air. Added the onion, chopped fine. Let it cook until the pieces turned translucent and sweet. Then the water, the beans, the carrots cut into coins. Salt, a pinch of wild sage she had found growing near the creek, crushing the leaves between her fingers to release their fragrance. She let it simmer while the stars came out overhead, bright and cold in the desert sky. It was not much. A simple stew, the kind of thing any competent cook could make. But Marlo had learned long ago that cooking was more than following a recipe. It was about care, about putting something of yourself into the food, about feeding not just bodies, but something deeper, about showing love through the work of your hands. When the stew was ready, she ladled half of it into the tin cup that was the only dish she owned, ate slowly, tasting each bite, feeling warmth spread through her chest and settle into her bones. The rest she left in the pot, covered with a cloth to keep it warm. At dawn, she woke to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. She had slept fitfully, waking every hour to tend to the fire, to shift position on the hard ground, to feel the baby move, and wonder what kind of world she was bringing this child into. The sky was pale gray, the sun not yet risen above the eastern ridge. She rebuilt the fire, heated the remaining stew until it was nearly boiling, then poured it carefully into her pot, and wrapped the pot in a clean cloth from her bag. She walked north, following the fence line. The land rose gently, scrub grass and sage giving way to better pasture. She could see cattle grazing in the distance, maybe 200 head, their shapes dark against the morning light. Beyond them, buildings. A main house, white painted, larger than anything else for miles. A barn with a slate roof. Corrals, bunkhouses. The whole complex spoke of money and planning, and someone who knew how to make a ranch work in harsh country. The Kincaid Ranch. She had heard the name in town yesterday, spoken with a mixture of respect and envy. Thatcher Kincaid, widower, richest man in the territory. 640 acres of deeded land, water rights to Willow Creek, more cattle than anyone could count without writing it down, and alone. That last part had been whispered by a woman at the general store, a quick comment to another customer while Marlowe was counting out coins for her purchases. Poor Mr. Kincaid, alone in that big house since Miss Ann passed. 5 years now, and he still won't so much as look at another woman. Some say he never will. Marlowe reached the gate just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, spilling golden light across the valley. The gate was iron, painted black, set between 2 stone pillars that must have cost a small fortune to build. The metalwork was fine, decorative scroll work that spoke of craftsmanship and wealth. Beyond the gate, a road led straight to the main house, lined with cottonwoods that someone had planted years ago and tended with care. Marlowe stood at the gate with the wrapped pot in her arms and her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in her mind during the long, sleepless night, had planned what she would say, how she would stand, what she would do if he said no. But now that she was here, the words felt small and insufficient. The fear felt larger than her courage. The gate was not locked. She pushed it open, the hinges creaking loud enough to wake the dead, and stepped through onto Kincaid land. A dog barked from somewhere behind the barn. Chickens scattered near the house, squawking their alarm. But no one came. Marlowe walked up the road, her boots crunching on gravel, the pot warm in her hands. She could smell the stew, rich and meaty and still faintly steaming, and hoped it was good enough to matter. She made it halfway to the house before the door opened. The man who stepped out filled the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame. Thatcher Kincaid. Marlowe had seen him once before, 3 days ago when she had first arrived in town and had been standing outside the general store gathering courage to go inside. He had ridden past on a big bay horse, moving with the easy confidence of a man who knew every inch of the land he owned. He had not looked at her, had not looked at anyone, had simply ridden through town like a ghost, silent and contained, and disappeared down the southern road. Now he stood on his porch, one hand on the doorframe, staring at her with eyes the color of winter sky. He was 34 years old, though he looked older. The sun and wind of the Arizona Territory had carved lines around his eyes and mouth, lines that spoke of hard work and harder losses. His hair was dark, shot through with early gray at the temples. His beard was close-trimmed, neat. He wore a simple work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and trousers tucked into boots that had seen years of hard use. Everything about him said competence, capability. A man who did not waste words or time or energy on things that did not matter. Marlowe stopped 10 feet from the porch, swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "Mr. Kincaid?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a small mercy. He did not respond, just looked at her with those winter eyes, then at the pot she held, then at her belly, round and undeniable beneath her faded dress, then back to her face. The silence stretched out like wire, taut and humming with unspoken questions. Marlowe took a breath. "My name is Marlowe Ashton. I arrived in Copper Ridge yesterday. I'm looking for work." Still nothing. Not a word, not a gesture, not even a flicker of expression. She pressed on, the words coming faster now. "I can cook, sir. Best cook you'll find in the territory. I can clean, mend, tend animals if you need it. I don't ask for much. Just a place to sleep and enough food to keep body and soul together until my baby comes." Thatcher Kincaid's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his beard. For a moment, Marlowe thought he might speak, thought he might ask her questions, demand explanations, want to know her story and judge whether it was worth believing. But he just shook his head once, sharp and final, and turned back toward the door. "Wait!" Marlowe stepped forward, and the pot slipped in her grip. She caught it, barely, the cloth falling away to expose the dented metal beneath. Steam rose in the cool morning air, carrying the smell of beef and onions. "Please, just wait." Thatcher paused in the doorway, did not turn around, but he paused. "I know what they say about me in town," Marlowe said, and her voice came out harder now, edged with something close to anger. "I know what I look like to you, a woman alone, with child, no husband to speak of. But I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Kincaid. I'm asking for work. I can earn my keep. I will earn my keep." He turned back slowly, his face unreadable. His eyes dropped to the pot in her hands, then to her face. "I got no need for help," he said. His voice was low and rough, like something long unused, like a tool left to rust in the rain. "Everyone needs help," Marlowe shot back. "Not from you." The words landed like a slap across the face. Marlowe's breath caught, but she did not look away, could not afford to look away. "Because I'm with child?" she asked quietly. "Or because the town's already decided I'm not worth the trouble?" Something flickered behind Thatcher Kincaid's eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or guilt. Perhaps both. "Both," he said. Marlowe felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She had expected rejection, had prepared for it, had built walls around her heart to protect against it. But the honesty of his answer, the blunt cruelty of it, hit harder than she had anticipated. She looked down at the pot in her hands, at the stew she had made with the last of her small funds, with care and attention, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I made this for you," she said. "Beef stew, still hot. It's not much, but it's good. You can have it or throw it away. Your choice." She set the pot on the ground at the base of his porch steps, straightened her spine, met his eyes one more time. "I'll ask somewhere else," she said. "There ain't nowhere else." "Then I'll make somewhere else." She turned and walked back down the road, spine straight, head high, boots crunching on gravel with each determined step. Even though her vision blurred and her chest felt like it was caving in, she did not let herself cry. Not here. Not in front of him. Behind her, Thatcher Kincaid stood on his porch and watched until she disappeared through the gate, until she was just a distant figure in a faded dress walking back toward the cottonwoods. Then he looked down at the pot of stew sitting on his step. Steam still rose from it, carrying a smell that hit him like a fist to the chest. Beef and onions, and something else. Something that reminded him of Sunday dinners when he was a boy, when his mother stood at the stove and his father came in from the fields, and everything in the world felt safe and known and permanent. He had not smelled that smell in 22 years. Thatcher Kincaid picked up the pot with hands that were not quite steady, carried it inside, closed the door, and sat at his kitchen table alone, eating stew that tasted like his mother's cooking, and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 5 long years. Marlowe made camp by Willow Creek that afternoon, and did not allow herself to think about what came next. She built a fire from deadfall wood, spread her shawl on the ground beneath the largest cottonwood, sat with her back against the rough bark, and watched the water move over stones, trying to convince herself that this was enough, that she could survive here alone until the baby came. She did not believe it. But belief and survival were not the same thing. She had learned that long ago. As the sun began to set, painting the sky violet and gold, Marlowe built up her fire and set about making something new. She had flour and lard and salt. She had water from the creek. She had the wooden spoon and her 2 hands, and the knowledge that bread was the most basic thing in the world, the foundation of civilization, the staff of life. She mixed the dough in her tin cup, working it with her fingers until it came together, smooth and elastic. No butter, no sugar, no milk or eggs, or any of the things that made bread rich and tender. Just flour and water and salt and the patience to do it right. She shaped it into a round loaf and buried it in the coals at the edge of her fire, covering it with ash and embers. While it baked, she sat and waited and felt the baby move inside her, restless and strong, as if it could sense her uncertainty. The bread took an hour. When she pulled it from the fire and brushed away the ash, the crust was dark and hard, the inside soft and steaming and smelling of grain and heat. She wrapped it in her spare cloth while it was still warm and stood, brushing dust from her dress. The walk back to the Kincaid gate seemed shorter in the twilight. She left the bread just inside the fence, tucked against one of the stone pillars where it would be visible from the road but sheltered from the wind. No note this time, no explanation, just bread wrapped in cloth, still warm from the fire. She walked back to her camp and lay down on her shawl and listened to the creek and the distant sound of cattle, and told herself that tomorrow she would find another plan, another way forward. But when she woke at dawn, the cloth was back. It sat folded neatly on a flat stone near her fire, the bread gone, the fabric clean and still warm from whatever hands had washed and returned it. Marlowe picked it up with shaking hands. He had not said anything, had not come to thank her or tell her to stop, or acknowledge what was happening in any way. But he had returned the cloth, had taken the time to wash it, to fold it, to bring it back in the dark hours before dawn. That had to mean something. She stood in the gray dawn light, holding the cloth, and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile, too dangerous, too easily crushed. But something close to it, something that whispered, maybe. That night, she made biscuits. Not the quick kind, dropped from a spoon. The slow kind, rolled and cut with the rim of her tin cup, each one shaped with care. She baked them over coals, turning them until they were golden brown on both sides, light and flaky and perfect. She wrapped them while they were still warm and carried them to the gate. The next morning, the cloth was back, folded, clean. The third night, she made soup. Beans she had soaked all day in creek water, simmered with wild onions she had found growing near the bank, and a rabbit she had snared in the sage. She poured it into her pot and stoppered it with a cork, carried it to the gate in the last light of day. The fourth night she made more stew, this time with venison from a haunch that someone, and she could guess who, had left hanging from a low branch near her camp while she was away gathering water. The fifth night she made griddle cakes, thin and sweet, cooked on a flat stone she had heated in her fire. Each morning the dish was returned, clean, folded, silent. It became a rhythm, a conversation without words, a truce without terms. Marlowe cooked, Thatcher accepted. Neither spoke. Neither acknowledged what was happening. But something was happening. The first week passed. The weather turned colder as October deepened. Marlowe's belly grew heavier. She learned the rhythms of the ranch from a distance, the sound of cattle being moved at dawn, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer in the afternoon, the low voices of ranch hands as they worked. She learned to recognize Thatcher's footsteps, even though she rarely saw him, heavy, measured, the gait of a man who moved with purpose and wasted no energy on unnecessary motion. And she saw the results of his presence. The fence near her camp, which had been sagging, was quietly repaired one morning while she was away gathering firewood. She came back to find new posts sunk deep, wire pulled tight, the whole section straight and true. A stack of firewood appeared beside her camp in the second week, split and seasoned, enough to last a month, even if the weather turned truly cold. A wool blanket, worn but clean and still warm, was draped over a branch in the third week while she was down at the creek washing her few clothes. She touched it with trembling fingers, felt the weight and warmth of it, and had to sit down because her knees would not hold her. He never spoke, never approached, never showed himself when she was present. But he was there, watching, providing. And Marlowe understood, in a way that did not need words, that this was his language. This was how he said, "I see you. I hear you. I don't know what to do with you, but I see you." So she kept cooking, and he kept returning the plates. It was enough. On the morning of the 15th day, Marlowe woke to frost on the ground and her breath pluming in the air. She built up her fire, warmed her hands over the flames, and set about making cornbread to leave at the gate. Her back ached, low and persistent, but she ignored it. There was work to do. She was halfway to the ranch, carrying the cornbread wrapped in cloth, when she heard it. A sharp, frightened whinny, high and desperate. Marlowe froze. The sound came again, closer this time, from somewhere beyond the barn. She hesitated. This was not her land, not her business. She had no right to go wandering around Thatcher Kincaid's property, poking into things that did not concern her. But the sound came a third time, terrified and hurting, and Marlowe found her feet moving before her mind could catch up. She set down the cornbread and changed direction, moving toward the noise as fast as her pregnant body would allow. She found the foal tangled in barbed wire near the eastern pasture fence. It was young, maybe 3 months old, all legs and ears and dark red coat that caught the morning light like fire. The wire had wrapped around its back legs, barbs digging into soft flesh with every movement. Blood streaked its coat. The foal thrashed and screamed, eyes rolling white with terror, making the injury worse with each panicked struggle. Marlowe's heart clenched. She approached slowly, hands out, voice low and soothing. "Easy, easy, baby. I've got you. You're going to be all right." The foal screamed again and kicked out wildly, nearly catching Marlowe in the ribs. She danced back, circled carefully, tried again. "Easy now. Nobody's going to hurt you. Let me help." It took 10 minutes of patience and several near misses before the foal stilled enough for Marlowe to get close. She knelt in the dirt, ignoring the cold seeping through her dress, ignoring the baby kicking inside her belly, and began working at the wire with stiff fingers. The barbs were vicious, twisted deep into muscle. Every time she tried to loosen one section, another pulled tighter, drawing fresh blood. The foal trembled beneath her hands, breath coming in harsh gasps that sounded almost like sobs. "I know," Marlowe whispered. "I know it hurts. Just a little longer, I promise." She did not hear Thatcher approach. One moment she was alone with the panicked foal, and the next he was there, crouched beside her, wire cutters in his large, scarred hands. Marlowe's breath hitched, but she did not pull away, did not question or explain. She held the foal steady while Thatcher cut through the wire with quick, precise movements. His hands were large and work-roughened, calloused from years of ranch work, but they moved with surprising gentleness, knowing exactly where to cut, how much pressure to use, how to free the animal without causing more pain. The last strand snapped free with a metallic ping. The foal lurched upright on shaking legs, stumbling but standing. Blood dripped from a dozen shallow cuts, but nothing looked deep, nothing that would not heal with time and care. Thatcher stood and caught the foal by the halter before it could bolt, ran a hand down its neck, checked each leg in turn with methodical thoroughness. His face was unreadable, but Marlowe could see tension in the set of his shoulders, relief in the way his hands gentled on the animal's coat. Marlowe stayed on her knees, breathing hard, hands trembling from adrenaline and effort. "Needs cleanin'," Thatcher said finally. His voice was rough from disuse, the words coming slow, like he had to remember how to shape them. "I can help," Marlowe said. He glanced at her, then at her belly, round and obvious, then back at the foal. "Come on, then." He led the foal toward the barn, and Marlowe followed, heart pounding for reasons she could not name. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay and leather and horse sweat, familiar and comforting. Morning light slanted through cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars. Thatcher tied the foal in a stall and fetched a bucket of water, clean rags, a tin of salve that smelled like pine tar, and something medicinal. Marlowe knelt beside him without being asked, and began washing the wounds with careful hands. They worked in silence. Marlowe cleaned, while Thatcher applied salve, and together they wrapped the worst of the cuts with strips of cloth torn from clean burlap. The foal stood quiet now, exhausted from pain and panic, sides heaving but calm under their gentle ministrations. When it was done, Thatcher sat back on his heels and wiped his hands on his trousers. "You got a steady hand," he said. Marlowe blinked. It was the first thing he had said to her that was not a refusal, or a warning, or a dismissal. "I've done this before," she said quietly. "Back home in Missouri, we had horses. My father taught me before he left. Said steady hands could save a life, whether human or animal." "Where's home now?" "Nowhere. Missouri was a long time ago." Thatcher nodded, as if that explained something. Maybe it did. He stood and offered her a hand. Marlowe hesitated, staring at his outstretched palm like it might be a trap. Then she took it. His palm was rough and warm, work-calloused but gentle, and he pulled her to her feet with an ease that spoke of great strength carefully controlled. For a moment they stood there, close enough that Marlowe could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the weariness that lived behind his careful expression like a permanent resident. "Thank you," she said, "for the firewood, the blanket, for not chasing me away." Thatcher's jaw worked, muscle jumping beneath his beard. "Didn't do it for thanks." "I know, but I'm giving it anyway." Something passed between them then, something fragile and uncertain, like the first thaw after a long winter, like ice beginning to crack under the weight of spring. Thatcher stepped back. "Foal needs watching. Can't put weight on that leg for a few days. Needs the wrappings changed twice a day, salve reapplied." "I can check on her," Marlowe offered, "if you'll allow it." He studied her for a long moment, those winter eyes searching her face for something she could not name. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Dawn and dusk. Don't overdo it. You're—" He gestured vaguely at her belly, seemed to lose the words, then finished. "Just don't overdo it." "I won't." He turned to go, then paused at the barn door, one hand on the rough wood. "Marlowe." She looked up. "Bread's good," he said. "Real good. Best I've tasted in a long time." And then he was gone, his boots heavy on the barn floor, leaving Marlowe standing alone, with her hand pressed to her belly, where the baby was kicking with unusual vigor. For the first time in months, she smiled. That evening, Marlowe left Stu at the gate, as she had for the past 2 weeks. But when she returned to her camp, as darkness fell, she found something waiting that had not been there before. A crate. Rough-built but sturdy, the kind used for hauling supplies across long distances. Inside, flour, enough for weeks of baking. Salt. Lard. A small sack of dried apples, coffee beans, a luxury she had not tasted in months, and a slab of bacon wrapped in butcher paper, thick and well cured. No note, no explanation. But Marlowe understood. She sat down beside her fire and pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders. The baby kicked and rolled inside her, active in the evening hour. She pressed her hand to the movement and let the tears come. Not from sadness this time, but from something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. That night, Marlowe left Stu at the gate, as she had every evening for the past 2 weeks. But when she returned to her camp, she could not sleep. The crate of supplies sat beside her fire like a promise, like a door opening where before there had been only walls. She kept touching the things inside, the flour soft and white, the bacon firm under her fingers, the coffee beans that smelled of possibility. The next morning, she rose before dawn and checked on the foal as Thatcher had instructed. The animal was awake, standing carefully in her stall. The wounds were clean, no signs of infection. Marlowe changed the wrappings with gentle hands, applied fresh salve, murmured words of encouragement. She was finishing when she heard footsteps behind her. Thatcher stood in the barn doorway, backlit by the rising sun. "How's she doing?" he asked. "Good. Wounds are clean." "She's putting a little weight on the leg already." He nodded, moved closer to check for himself. Satisfied, he turned to her. "I got a proposition." Marlowe's heart suddenly hammered against her ribs. Thatcher looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He was not a man accustomed to asking for things. That much was clear in every line of his body. "I got 8 ranch hands need feeding," he said without preamble. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Man who used to cook for them quit last month. Rode out without notice. Been making do with what the hands can scrape together, but it ain't sustainable. Men are grumbling. Work's suffering." He paused, met her eyes. "You want the job?" It's yours. $20 a month. Room in the foreman's old cabin. Got a stove, a bed, a door that locks. Work starts at 5 in the morning, ends when supper's cleared and the kitchen's clean. Sundays you get the afternoon off after dinner's served. Marlowe could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at this man who had turned her away 2 weeks ago and was now offering her salvation. "The hands won't like it," she said quietly. "The hands will do what I tell them, or they'll find work elsewhere." Thatcher's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "I'm asking if you want to work, same as I'd ask any hired hand. Yes or no?" Marlowe looked past him into the barn, where the foal she had saved was watching them with dark, curious eyes. She thought of the past 2 weeks, sleeping on the ground, cooking over an open fire, wondering each day if this would be the day her body gave out, or her luck ran dry, or the baby came early in the cold and the dark with no one to help. She thought of the baby growing inside her, who would need more than she could provide alone. "Yes," she said, "I want to work." Thatcher nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Good. Move your things this afternoon. I'll show you the kitchen and the cabin. Breakfast starts at 5 tomorrow morning." He turned to leave, then paused. "Marlowe." "Yes?" "Thank you. For the foal. For the bread. For not giving up." And then he was gone, his boots heavy on the barn floor, leaving Marlowe standing in the doorway, with her hands pressed to her belly and tears streaming down her face. The foreman's cabin was smaller than Marlowe had imagined, but it was more than she had dared hope for in her darkest moments by the creek. A single room, maybe 12 feet square. A narrow iron bed stood against one wall, the mattress thin but clean. A potbelly stove squatted in the corner, freshly blacked and ready for use, with a stack of kindling beside it. A wooden table with 2 chairs occupied the space beneath the window. The floor was swept clean. Someone, Thatcher, she suspected, had left a bundle of firewood by the door. Marlowe set her carpetbag on the bed and pressed her hand against the small of her back, which had been aching since dawn. The baby shifted inside her, a rolling movement that made her breath catch. "We made it," she whispered to her unborn child. "We're going to be all right." She unpacked her few belongings, 2 dresses, both faded and mended, the shawl, her mother's hairbrush, the wooden spoon that had traveled 300 miles and cooked more meals than she could count. When everything was put away, she stood in the center of the room and tried to absorb the reality of it. A door that locked, a roof that did not leak, a stove that would keep her warm through the winter. Work that meant something beyond mere survival. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Miss Ashton?" A girl's voice, young and tentative. Marlowe opened the door to find a girl of perhaps 16 standing on the step, flour dusting her apron and her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. She had wide brown eyes, a spattering of freckles across her nose, and a shy smile. "I'm Rosalie," the girl said. "You're Rosie. I work in the main house, cleaning and mending and whatever Mr. Kincaid needs doing. He said you'd be starting tomorrow, and I should show you the kitchen and explain how things work." She gestured toward a building Marlowe had not yet explored, a long, low structure set between the barn and the bunkhouse. "He also said to tell you the hands eat at 6, noon, and 6. Breakfast is usually biscuits and gravy, bacon, eggs, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Dinner's whatever you can make that'll keep them going through the afternoon. Sandwiches, stew, something hearty. Supper's the big meal. Meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables if we got them, something sweet if there's time." Rosie paused for breath, then added with genuine warmth, "I know it sounds like a lot, but I'll help where I can. Mr. Kincaid's a good man, even if he don't say much. If he says you're working here, that's good enough for me." Marlowe felt her throat tighten. "Thank you, Rosie. That's very kind." The girl shrugged, but her smile widened. "Ain't kind, just practical. Place has been running on cold beans and hard bread for a month. We need a real cook, something fierce. Come on, I'll show you where everything is." The kitchen was better equipped than Marlowe had expected. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface large enough to hold 6 pots at once, the kind of stove that could feed an army if you knew how to use it. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with dishes and tin plates and cups for the ranch hands. A long work table stood in the center, scarred and stained from years of use, but solid as bedrock. A pantry in the corner held flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans, preserved vegetables in glass jars. It was a kitchen built for feeding working men, built for someone who knew what they were doing. Marlowe ran her hand over the work table and felt something settle in her chest, like a key turning in a lock. She could do this. "Mr. Kincaid had me clean it yesterday," Rosie said. "Ain't been used proper in a month, but it's ready now. Stove draws good, plenty of firewood out back. Pumps just outside the door." "It's perfect," Marlowe said quietly. And it was. The first meal Marlowe cooked for the Kincaid Ranch was breakfast on a cold October morning, and she rose in darkness to prepare it. She lit the stove at 4:30, grateful for the warmth as the fire caught and spread. While the stove heated, she mixed biscuit dough, real buttermilk biscuits, not the hard trail kind. She had found buttermilk in the cold cellar, cream that had been left to sour, and she used it lavishly, working the dough until it was soft and yielding under her hands. She made gravy from bacon drippings, the way her mother had taught her. Browned the flour first, whisking constantly to prevent lumps, then added milk slowly until it thickened to just the right consistency. Salt, pepper, a pinch of sage from the dried herbs hanging in the pantry. She fried eggs, a dozen at a time, in the big cast-iron skillet. Bacon until it was crisp but not burnt. Coffee in the huge pot, strong enough to strip paint, but smooth enough to drink black. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of years spent in kitchens, and for the first time since leaving Missouri, she felt like herself again. Not a refugee, not a charity case. A cook. Someone with a skill that mattered. The ranch hands filed in at 6 sharp. 7 men, dusty and bleary-eyed, smelling of horses and tobacco and morning cold. They stopped short when they saw Marlowe standing at the stove, spatula in hand, her belly round beneath her apron. The silence stretched out uncomfortable and thick. "Morning," Marlowe said evenly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Sit down. Food's ready." They exchanged glances. One of them, a lanky man with a scar across his chin and eyes that held too much calculation, snorted audibly. "Where's Tom?" he asked, his voice deliberately loud. "Tom quit last month," Thatcher said from the doorway. He stepped inside, hat in hand, and fixed the scarred man with a look that could freeze water mid-flow. "Miss Ashton's the cook now. You got a problem with that, Silas? You can draw your pay and ride out before breakfast." Silas Wade's jaw worked, anger and calculation warring in his expression. But after a long moment, he said nothing, just sat down hard, the chair scraping against the floor. The others followed suit, moving like men who knew better than to argue with their boss. Marlowe served the food without comment, moving efficiently between stove and table. The men ate in silence, forks scraping against tin plates, the only sounds in the room. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging, but she kept her chin up and her movements steady. When the plates were clean, and they were all clean, scraped bare, Thatcher stood. "Good meal, Miss Ashton. Thank you." "You're welcome, Mr. Kincaid." The hands muttered their thanks, some grudging, some genuine, and filed out into the morning cold. Silas Wade was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at Marlowe, his expression unreadable. "Biscuits were decent," he said. It was not much, but it was something. Rosie appeared as soon as the men were gone, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How'd it go?" "They ate everything," Marlowe said. "Course they did. Probably the best meal they've had in weeks." Rosie started gathering dishes. "Don't mind Silas. He's been angling for the foreman job since old Pete died last spring. Thought Mr. Kincaid might promote him. When that didn't happen, he got sour." "Why didn't Mr. Kincaid promote him?" Rosie's expression darkened. "Because Silas drinks, and when he drinks, he gets mean. Mr. Kincaid don't tolerate mean, not on his ranch." Marlowe filed that information away and set about planning the next meal. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Marlowe rose at 4:30 each morning, lit the stove, baked biscuits or cornbread or griddle cakes, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. By 5:30, she had breakfast ready, eggs, bacon, potatoes, whatever she could make that would fuel men through a long day of hard labor. Dinner at noon was simpler: sandwiches, soup, leftover stew heated over the fire. The men ate quickly and went back to work. But supper was where Marlowe showed what she could do. Monday, beef stew, the beef cut from a quarter Thatcher had butchered over the weekend. She cooked it low and slow with carrots and onions and potatoes, adding bay leaves and thyme from the dried herbs, letting it simmer all afternoon until the meat fell apart at the touch of a spoon. Tuesday, fried chicken, each piece dredged in flour seasoned with salt and pepper and paprika, cooked in lard until the skin was crispy and golden, and the meat was tender and juicy inside. Wednesday, pot roast with gravy so rich it could stand on its own, served over biscuits that soaked up every precious drop. Thursday, beans and ham hocks, cooked until the beans were creamy and the meat fell off the bone, served with cornbread and butter. Friday, pan-fried trout from Willow Creek, cornmeal cakes, greens wilted with bacon fat. Saturday, whatever was left over from the week, transformed into something new. Beef hash with fried eggs on top, chicken pot pie with a flaky crust, vegetable soup rich with bone broth. And then Sunday. On her first Sunday, in the second week of working at the ranch, Marlowe rose even earlier than usual and set about making the kind of meal she had not cooked since her mother died. Fried chicken, but not the quick weekday kind. This was the slow kind, each piece brined overnight in buttermilk and salt, dredged in seasoned flour mixed with just a hint of cayenne, fried until the crust was the color of mahogany and so crisp it shattered at the first bite, while the meat inside stayed impossibly moist. Mashed potatoes, whipped with butter and cream until they were clouds on a plate. So smooth and rich they needed no gravy, though she made gravy anyway. Gravy made from the chicken drippings, thick and savory and perfect for drowning everything on the plate. Biscuits, of course, always biscuits on Sunday. But these were special biscuits, made with extra butter, brushed with melted butter before baking, served hot enough to melt more butter when you split them open. And for dessert, apple pie. She had found the recipe in her mother's handwriting on a scrap of paper tucked into her carpet bag. The ink faded, but still readable. Apples from the dried fruit in the pantry, reconstituted with a little water and cooked down with sugar and cinnamon and a pinch of nutmeg. All wrapped in a crust she rolled thin and crimped with her fingers into a pattern her mother had taught her when she was 8 years old. When the men sat down to eat, they stared at the spread before them like they had never seen food before. And when they tasted it, the room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with discomfort and everything to do with reverence. Thatcher ate slowly, methodically, his eyes closed as if he needed to concentrate on every flavor. He took a bite of chicken, chewed carefully, swallowed. Took a bite of potatoes, smooth and creamy on his tongue. A piece of biscuit soaked in gravy. Then he stopped, set down his fork with a soft clink against the tin plate, opened his eyes. "This tastes like my mother's cooking," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Marlowe's heart hammered. "Rosie told me what herbs your ma favored, what spices she used. The rest was just paying attention." Thatcher looked at her across the table, and for the first time since they had met, his expression was completely unguarded, vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. "I haven't tasted this in 22 years, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. The other men looked down at their plates, giving him privacy in the only way ranch hands knew how, by pretending not to notice. Marlowe felt tears prick her eyes. "Then I'm glad I could make it for you, Mr. Kincaid." He nodded, unable to speak, and picked up his fork again. Kept eating, but slower now, savoring every bite like it was a memory made solid. After that meal, something changed. After that Sunday, Thatcher began staying in the kitchen after supper. Not every night, but 2 or 3 times a week, he would linger after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, settling into one of the chairs at the work table with a cup of coffee while Marlowe cleaned up. At first he said nothing, just sat and watched while she washed dishes, scraped pots, prepared dough for the next day's bread. His presence was oddly comfortable, like a cat that has decided your lap is acceptable. Then one night in the 3rd week, he started talking. Small things at first. The weather turning colder, the price of cattle at market, a fence on the north pasture that needed mending before winter came in earnest. But slowly, over the course of that week, the conversations deepened. He told her about the ranch. 640 acres, purchased 12 years ago when the land was cheap and the territory was still wild enough that you had to sleep with a rifle beside your bed. He had built it from nothing, working 18-hour days, sleeping in a tent until he could afford to build the bunkhouse, then the barn, then finally the main house. "Took me 5 years to build what you see now," he said one evening, hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Every board, every nail, most of it placed with my own hands. Had help, of course, hired men when I could afford them. But in the beginning, it was just me and the land and the determination not to fail." "Why here?" Marlowe asked. "Why Arizona?" "Land was cheap, water rights were available if you knew where to look, and nobody here knew me, knew my history. Could start fresh, be whoever I made myself into." He did not elaborate on what history he was escaping, and Marlowe did not ask. He spoke about the cattle, 240 head of Hereford, purchased over years, bred carefully for hardiness and meat quality. He knew each breeding line, which bulls produced the best calves, which cows were good mothers. He spoke about the horses, 18 of them, each one named and known. Thunder, the big bay stallion Thatcher rode every day, 15 hands high and strong as iron. Storm, Thunder's half-brother, mean-tempered but faster than anything in the territory. Lightning, the mare they used for cutting cattle, smart enough to anticipate a steer's moves before it made them. Blaze, Copper, Dust, Silver, working horses, reliable and steady. And Russet, the foal Marlowe had saved, who was healing well and would grow into a fine horse if her legs stayed sound and her spirit stayed strong. Thatcher spoke about the ranch with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with work. With building something that would last. With leaving a mark on the land that mattered. He did not speak about his wife. Not at first. But in the 4th week, on a cold November evening, when the wind rattled the windows and the fire in the stove burned low, he said, "She would have liked you." Marlowe looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. "Sir?" "Anne, my wife. She would have liked you." He stared into his coffee cup, as if he could read the future in the dark liquid. She loved to cook, used to say that feeding people was a way of showing love when words weren't enough, that you could tell how much someone cared by the effort they put into a meal. He paused. "She would have appreciated what you do here, the care you take." Marlowe's hands stilled in the dough. "Rosie told me she passed during childbirth. 5 years ago come January." Thatcher's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man reciting facts he had learned to live with through sheer repetition. "Baby was breech. Doc couldn't turn it. Couldn't get here in time from town. They both died before I could even hitch the wagon." He looked up, met Marlowe's eyes. "I found them when I came in from the north pasture. Been gone 2 days, moving cattle to winter range. Came home expecting supper and found—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Found silence." Marlowe felt her throat close with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry. I tell you this because you deserve to know why I turned you away at first, why I hesitated even after you'd proven yourself." Thatcher set down his coffee cup with careful precision. "It wasn't about you, about your situation or what the town said. It was about me, about not wanting to watch another pregnant woman suffer, about being afraid I'd fail again." "You didn't fail Anne," Marlowe said softly. "Didn't I? I was gone when she needed me. Didn't get back in time. Didn't—" "You can't control everything, Mr. Kincaid. Sometimes things just happen. Sometimes people die, and there's nothing anyone could have done. I know that here," he tapped his head. "But here," he pressed his fist against his chest, "here, it still feels like failure." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, 2 people carrying grief they had never asked for, trying to find a way forward through the dark. "I understand," Marlowe said, "because I'm afraid too." "Of what?" "Of everything. Of the baby coming. Of something going wrong. Of being alone when it happens. Of—" her voice broke. "Of not being strong enough." Thatcher reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough, work-calloused, warm. "You're the strongest person I know," he said. "You walked 300 miles, pregnant and alone. You camped in the cold and kept cooking, even when you had every reason to give up. You saved a horse's life while carrying a child. If that's not strength, I don't know what is." Marlowe looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, the kitchen warm around them and the wind howling outside. Then Thatcher squeezed her hand gently and let go. "Better let you finish that bread," he said. Got a full day tomorrow. He stood, carried his cup to the wash basin, and headed for the door. But he paused with his hand on the latch. "Marlo?" "Yes?" "You're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, whatever you need, you're not alone." And then he was gone, leaving Marlo standing in the warm kitchen with tears streaming down her face and hope blooming in her chest like a flower pushing through frozen ground. In the 5th week of Marlo's employment, as November deepened and her belly grew noticeably heavier, Thatcher began appearing in the kitchen after supper with more than just conversation. He brought a knife and a bowl. "What are you doing?" Marlo asked the first time, surprised to see him settling at the work table with a pile of potatoes. "Helping." "Mr. Kincaid, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to. Want to." He started peeling potatoes with swift, efficient movements, his large hands handling the knife with surprising dexterity. They worked in silence for a while, Marlo kneading bread dough, Thatcher peeling vegetables. The only sounds were the scrape of the knife against potato skin, the rhythmic thump of dough against the work table, the crackle of the fire in the stove. It was Marlo who spoke first. "Why?" Thatcher set down the knife, looked at her. "Because you're 7 months pregnant and working yourself to the bone to feed my ranch hands. Because you never complain, never ask for help, never expect special treatment." He paused. "And because Anne used to peel potatoes while I kneaded bread. Used to say it was the best part of her day, just sitting together, working side by side while the evening settled in." Marlo's eyes stung with tears. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman." "Oh, she was. And she'd box my ears if she knew I was letting a pregnant woman do all this work alone." After that, Thatcher came to the kitchen most evenings. He chopped vegetables, hauled water from the pump, carried heavy pots, never in front of the ranch hands, always after they had gone to the bunkhouse. But the help was there, steady and reliable as sunrise. And slowly, in the quiet hours between supper and sleep, they learned each other. Marlo told him about Missouri, about her mother dying of consumption when Marlo was 11, leaving 4 young children and a father who could not cope with the loss. About raising her 3 younger siblings alone when her father disappeared, working in hotel kitchens, learning to make something out of nothing, learning that survival required more than luck. She told him about meeting Ben Ashton, a good man, kind and hard-working, who had promised her a life of safety and partnership. About their brief marriage, happy despite its brevity. About Ben dying of cholera in a quarantine camp, and how his family had looked at her pregnancy and decided she must have been unfaithful. "The baby's his," she said quietly, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "Ben was the only man I ever—" She stopped, cheeks flushing. "But they didn't believe me. Said the timing didn't add up, though it did. They just didn't want it to." Thatcher's hands clenched into fists. "They should have believed you, should have protected you." "Should have. Didn't." Marlo's voice was steady, despite the pain in her eyes. "They sent me away with nothing and told me never to come back. Said I was lucky they didn't have me arrested." "Lucky," Thatcher repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "That's what they said." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been betrayed by the people who should have helped her, who had traveled 300 miles alone and pregnant, who had refused to give up even when the whole world seemed set against her. "I believe you," he said. Marlo felt something break open in her chest, something that had been sealed tight for 3 long months. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what that means." I think I do." They sat in the warm kitchen, and the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was companionable, almost peaceful. Outside, the wind picked up, but inside they were warm and safe, and, for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt quite so alone. The trouble started in the 6th week after Marlo began working at the ranch. She was drawing water from the pump behind the kitchen when she heard voices. Low, angry, male, coming from the barn. "I don't care what Kincaid says. It ain't right, her being here." Silas Wade's voice, thick with resentment. "She's just cooking, Silas. What's it matter?" Another voice, younger, uncertain. One of the newer hands. "What's it matter? She's carrying some man's bastard, living under Kincaid's roof, eating his food, sleeping in a cabin that should have gone to a real ranch hand. And he's in that kitchen every night, helping her, talking with her like she's something special instead of what she is. And what's that? A whore, probably. Women don't end up alone and pregnant without a reason." Marlo's hands tightened on the pump handle until her knuckles went white. She should walk away, should ignore it, should go back to the kitchen and pretend she had heard nothing. But her feet would not move. "You don't know that," the younger voice said, but it lacked conviction. "I know enough, and I know Kincaid's making a mistake. Mark my words, this'll end badly, and when it does, she'll be the first one out the door." Marlo turned and walked back to the kitchen, spine rigid, eyes burning with humiliation and anger. She had known this would happen, known that respect had to be earned inch by inch, and even then some men would never give it. But knowing did not make it hurt less. That evening she served supper in silence. The food was perfect, as always: roast beef, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, apple cobbler for dessert. The hands ate without looking at her, and she did not look at them. When the meal was over and the men had gone, Thatcher lingered as he often did. "Something wrong?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. Marlo scrubbed at a pot with more force than necessary. "No, sir." "Marlo." She stopped, set the pot down, turned to face him. "They're talking," she said flatly. "About me. About why you hired me. They think I'm—" She could not say the word. It stuck in her throat like a bone. "I know what they think." Thatcher's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "And I don't give a damn." "You should. They're your men." "They're hired hands. They work for me, not the other way around." He stepped closer. "If someone said something to you, I need to know." "It doesn't matter." "It does." Marlo met his eyes. "What are you going to do, Mr. Kincaid? Fire them all? Run off every man who thinks poorly of me? You'd have no crew left." "Then I'd work the ranch myself." The words hung between them, fierce and final. Marlo's breath caught. "You don't mean that." "I do." Thatcher's jaw was set, his hands loose at his sides, his whole posture radiating certainty. "I hired you because you're the best cook I've ever had, and because you've got more backbone than most men I've met. What the town thinks, what the hands think, that's their problem, not mine." His eyes held hers, unwavering. "And if they can't see past their own small-mindedness, then they can leave." Marlo's throat closed. She looked down at her hands, reddened and raw from work. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Thatcher was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I know what it's like to be judged for something that wasn't your fault. To have people decide your story for you before you ever got a chance to tell it." He paused. "And because you've shown me that there's still good in this world, still people worth fighting for." Marlo looked up, eyes wet with unshed tears. "Thank you." Thatcher nodded. "Get some rest. You look tired." He turned and left, boots heavy on the wooden floor. And in the morning, Silas Wade was gone. But Wade's dismissal did not end the trouble. It made it worse. Over the next few days, small acts of sabotage began to plague the kitchen. First, salt was poured into the flour bin, ruining 30 pounds of flour and forcing Marlowe to throw out an entire morning's worth of biscuit dough. Then someone left the door to the chicken coop open in the night. The hens escaped, and it took Rosie and Marlowe half the morning to round them up, delaying dinner by 2 hours. The pump handle broke, though it had been working fine the day before. When Thatcher examined it, he found the bolt had been deliberately loosened. A barrel of salted pork was knocked over, spilling brine across the pantry floor. Each incident was small. Each could be explained as an accident, but together they formed a pattern. Marlowe was being targeted. The other ranch hands began to eye her with suspicion. If she was causing problems, maybe Wade had been right to complain. Maybe having her here was more trouble than it was worth. Thatcher investigated each incident with grim determination, but he could find no proof, no clear culprit. Until the evening he found Silas Wade's knife at the scene of the broken pump. Wade had not left the territory after being fired. He had been camping somewhere in the hills, coming back in the night to cause havoc, nursing his resentment like a wound. Thatcher rode out at dawn and found Wade's camp 3 miles north, in a stand of cottonwoods near the creek. The confrontation was brief and ugly. "You're done," Thatcher said, his hand resting on the rifle across his saddle. "Pack up and ride out. If I see you on my land again, I'll have the sheriff arrest you for trespassing and sabotage." Wade spat into the dust. "You'll regret this, Kincaid. That woman's brought nothing but trouble, and it's only going to get worse. You wait." "Get out." Wade left, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Thatcher returned to the ranch and told Marlowe what had happened. "It's over," he said. "Wade's gone. You're safe." But Marlowe knew better than to believe that trouble, once invited, was so easily dismissed. And she was right. The 7th week was deceptively peaceful. With Wade gone and the sabotage stopped, the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. The hands, seeing that Thatcher was serious about protecting Marlowe, grew more respectful, some even friendly. Marlowe was 7.5 months pregnant now, her belly heavy and low. She moved more slowly, tired more easily, but she refused to slack on her work. Rosie took on more of the heavy lifting without being asked, hauling water and tending fires. And Thatcher continued to appear each evening to help with the prep work for the next day. One evening in the 7th week, Marlowe was humming while she worked, an old hymn her mother used to sing, and she did not notice Thatcher had stopped peeling potatoes to listen. When she looked up and caught him staring, she blushed. "Sorry, didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me." His voice was soft. "It's nice. The singing. House has been too quiet for too long." They worked in comfortable silence after that. But something had shifted. Something gentle and warm, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. On Sunday of the 7th week, Marlowe made her most ambitious meal yet. She roasted a whole side of beef, glazed with honey and herbs, made 3 kinds of vegetables, baked enough bread to feed an army, and for dessert, a cake. 4 layers of yellow cake with cream frosting, decorated with preserved cherries. The hands ate until they could barely move, and when they left, they were smiling. "Best meal I ever had, Miss Ashton," one of them said, "bar none." The others murmured agreement. Even the ones who had been skeptical at first now had to admit, Marlowe Ashton was the finest cook in the territory. That night, after everyone had gone, Thatcher helped Marlowe clean up. "You outdid yourself today," he said. "Wanted to make something special. Show my appreciation for everything." "You don't need to show appreciation. You've earned your place here 10 times over." Marlowe set down the plate she was drying and turned to face him. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "how much it means to me, what you've done. Giving me work, defending me, treating me like a person instead of a problem to be solved." Thatcher set down his own dish. "Marlowe, you were never a problem. You were—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. "You were an answer to a question I didn't know I was asking." Their eyes met across the kitchen, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the baby kicked hard enough that Marlowe gasped and pressed her hand to her belly. The moment broke. "You should rest," Thatcher said, his voice rough. "Long day tomorrow." "Yes. Good night, Mr. Kincaid." "Good night, Marlowe." He left, and Marlowe stood alone in the kitchen, one hand on her belly, feeling the baby move and wondering what the future held. She would find out soon enough, because in the 8th week, everything would change. The 8th week began with perfect weather, crisp autumn mornings, warm afternoons, clear skies that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single cloud. But Thatcher Kincaid knew better than to trust perfect weather in late November. The air tasted wrong, too dry, too still, the kind of stillness that came before storms, before disasters, before the world caught fire. The cattle were restless, lowing and pacing in the pastures. The horses refused to settle, tossing their heads and rolling their eyes at shadows. Even Russet, usually calm and sweet-tempered, now that her wounds had healed, kicked at her stall door and whinnied with distress. On Tuesday of the 8th week, Thatcher woke at 3 in the morning with his heart racing and a certainty in his gut that something was coming. He spent the day preparing, moving cattle closer to Willow Creek, where water would provide some protection if fire came, soaking burlap sacks and draping them over the roofs of the buildings, clearing brush away from the structures, creating fire breaks, filling every barrel and bucket with water. The ranch hands worked with grim efficiency, understanding without being told that this was serious. Marlowe helped where she could, hauling buckets of water from the pump despite the weight of her belly, despite the ache that had settled low in her back and would not ease. "You should rest," Rosie said, taking a bucket from Marlowe's hands. "I'm fine. You're 8 months pregnant and working like a field hand. Mr. Kincaid would have my hide if he knew." "Then we won't tell him." But Thatcher knew anyway. He appeared beside her as she was filling another bucket, his face streaked with soot from burning a controlled fire break on the western ridge. "Kitchen. Now. Sit down." "Thatcher, I can—" "That's an order, Marlowe." His voice was sharp, sharper than she had ever heard it. Not angry, terrified. She went. What Thatcher did not know, what no one knew, was that 3 miles north, in a stand of cottonwoods near Willow Creek, Silas Wade was making his own preparations. Wade had not left the territory as ordered. He had camped in the hills, nursing his rage like a coal that refused to die, watching the Kincaid ranch from a distance and planning his revenge. He had bought whiskey at the saloon in Copper Ridge, enough to drown his conscience. He had listened to men talk about how Thatcher Kincaid had chosen a pregnant whore over his own crew, how the whole situation was unnatural and wrong. And he had decided that if he could not have his job back, then Kincaid would have nothing at all. On Tuesday afternoon, while Thatcher was moving cattle and Marlowe was hauling water, Wade rode to the western ridge with a can of kerosene and a box of matches. He waited until the sun began to set, painting the sky blood red. Then he poured kerosene along the dry grass and fence line, working methodically, creating a line of accelerant that would ensure the fire spread fast and hot. He struck a match, watched the grass catch, watched the flames begin to run like water, racing down the hill toward the ranch buildings. Then he mounted his horse and rode hard for the northern border, fleeing the disaster he had created. Behind him, the fire grew. The fire came to the Kincaid Ranch on a Thursday evening in late November, and it came fast. Marlowe was in the kitchen preparing supper, beef stew, cornbread, coffee, when the first contraction hit. It started as a tightening, a band of pressure around her belly that made her breath catch. She set down the wooden spoon and gripped the edge of the work table, waiting for it to pass. It did, but 10 minutes later it came again, stronger. Marlowe looked out the window. The sun was setting, painting the western sky the color of blood and gold, and on the ridge above the ranch, a thin column of smoke rose into the still air. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The door burst open. Thatcher stood there, face grim, already moving. "Fire's on the western ridge. Wind's picking up. We need to move the horses to the creek, get the cattle." He stopped, looked at her, saw the way she was gripping the table, the way her face had gone pale. "Marlowe?" "It's starting," she said. "The baby. I'm sorry, Another contraction cut off her words, this one stronger, a vice grip that stole her breath and made her double over. Thatcher was across the room in 3 strides. He caught her before she could fall, his hands strong and sure. "How far apart?" 10 minutes, maybe less." He swore, low and vicious, a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Then he called over his shoulder, "Rosie, get Dr. Hayes, now!" Rosie appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "Doc's on the other side of the territory, tending to the Miller boy with scarlet fever. Won't be back till tomorrow at the earliest." Thatcher's jaw clenched so hard, Marlowe heard his teeth grind. He looked out the window at the smoke, now thicker, darker, spreading like a stain across the sky. The wind was rising. He could hear it in the cottonwoods, a low moan that spoke of fire weather, of danger coming fast. He made a decision. "Get blankets, water, clean cloth, everything you can carry. We're going to the east barn." "Why the east barn?" "Because it's stone. Built it that way after a fire 10 years back. Stone walls and slate roof. If the fire comes, it's the only building that'll stand." He scooped Marlowe into his arms as another contraction seized her. She cried out, her hands fisting in his shirt, and he held her tighter. "I've got you," he said. "I've got you." He ran. The world became a blur of motion and pain. Marlowe felt Thatcher's heart hammering against her side, felt the strength of his arms holding her secure despite the awkward burden. Behind them she heard men shouting, cattle bellowing in panic, the first distant roar of fire cresting the ridge. The east barn was 200 yards from the kitchen. It felt like 200 miles. Thatcher kicked the door open and carried her inside. The barn smelled of hay and stone and horse sweat, familiar and comforting. The walls were thick sandstone, built to last, with a slate roof that would not burn. 3 horses occupied the stalls, Thunder, Storm, and Russet, all of them nickering nervously at the smoke they could smell, but not yet see. Thatcher set Marlowe down on a pile of fresh hay in the largest stall, spreading blankets as Rosie burst through the door with an armload of supplies. "Spread them out," he ordered. "Make her as comfortable as we can." "Comfortable?" Marlowe laughed. a sharp sound edged with pain and fear. "Thatcher, I'm about to have a baby in a barn while the ranch burns down. Comfortable's not in the cards." "Then we'll settle for alive." He stripped off his shirt with swift, economical movements and tore it into strips with hands that shook despite his calm voice. Rosie brought water, more blankets, clean cloth. They worked together in grim silence, preparing for something neither of them was truly prepared for. Outside, the fire drew closer. Marlowe could hear it now, not just the roar, but the snap and crackle of individual flames consuming dry wood and grass, the scream of terrified animals, the shouts of men trying to save what could be saved, knowing it was already too late. Another contraction hit, stronger than before. She bore down against it, feeling her body prepare for the work ahead, and wondered distantly if she would survive this night. "How long between?" Thatcher asked, his voice steady, even though his hands trembled. 5 minutes, maybe less." His face went pale beneath the soot and sweat. He had seen this before, knew what fast labor could mean. Anne had labored for 18 hours before the end came, suffering through every minute while he stood helpless. But fast could be just as dangerous. Complications could arise before anyone could react. "Rosie, you ever helped with a birthing?" "My ma had 6 babies after me. I know some." "Then you're going to help. I'll—" He stopped, swallowed hard against the memories threatening to choke him. "I'll do what needs doing." He positioned himself at the foot of the makeshift bed, his large hands gentle despite their roughness. Marlowe could see the fear in his eyes, bright and terrible, the memory of another birth, another woman, another outcome that haunted him still. "Thatcher," she gasped between contractions, "if something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen." "If it does, promise me you'll take care of her, the baby. Promise me." "I promise." His voice broke on the word. "But you're going to be fine. You hear me? You're going to be fine." He said it like a prayer, like an order, like he could make it true through sheer force of will. The contractions came faster now, 3 minutes apart, 2, 1. Smoke began to seep through cracks in the barn walls, thin and gray at first, then thicker, darker. Outside, the fire had reached the western buildings. Marlowe could hear timber crashing, glass shattering from the heat. The temperature inside the barn was rising despite the thick stone walls. "I need to push," Marlowe said. Thatcher nodded. "Then push." She bore down with everything she had, every muscle straining, every nerve screaming with effort and pain. Pain like she had never known. Pain that whited out thought and left only animal need, only the desperate drive to bring this life into the world. Again, and again, and again. "I can see the head," Thatcher said, his voice shaking but steady. "Marlowe, I can see. Keep going. Just keep going." Rosie held Marlowe's hand, murmuring encouragement through her own tears. The girl was crying, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face, but her voice stayed steady, strong. Outside, something exploded. The kitchen, probably, the stove overheating and rupturing. A beam crashed down somewhere close, and the horses screamed in their stalls. But Marlowe barely heard it. All her focus, all her being, had narrowed to this single moment, to the life fighting its way into the world, to the man whose hands were sure and gentle despite his terror. One more push. One more. The baby slid free in a rush of fluid and blood. For one terrible, eternal moment, there was no sound. The baby lay still in Thatcher's hands, tiny, perfect, silent. Thatcher's face went white as bone. His hands trembled. Marlowe could see him being transported, dragged back 5 years to another barn, another baby who would never draw breath, another moment of hope that died stillborn. "No," he whispered. "Not again. Please, God, not again." He cleared the baby's mouth with his finger, turned the infant over, rubbed the small back with the heel of his palm, desperate movements that grew more frantic with each passing second. Nothing. His eyes met Marlowe's, and she saw in them a grief so deep it had no bottom, a pain that would break him if this child did not live. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice shattering. "Damn you, breathe!" He tilted the baby's head back, placed his mouth over the tiny nose and mouth, and breathed gently into lungs that had never tasted air. Once, twice. The baby's chest hitched. The world held its breath. Then the child screamed. The sound was thin and furious, and the most beautiful thing Marlowe had ever heard. The baby's face flushed from blue to pink in seconds, tiny fists waving in outrage at the violence of birth, at the smoke and heat and chaos of the world into which she had arrived. Thatcher's face crumpled. He clutched the baby to his chest and wept, great heaving sobs that shook his whole frame, tears streaming down his face and dripping onto the tiny, perfect child in his arms. "She's alive," he choked out. "Marlowe, she's alive. She's breathing." "Give her to me," Marlowe whispered. Thatcher placed the baby on Marlowe's chest with hands that shook so badly he could barely tie off the cord with a strip of his ruined shirt. He covered them both with a blanket, and for one suspended moment there was nothing but mother and child and the fierce joy of survival. Then a beam crashed down outside, close enough to shake the ground. Thatcher jerked back to the present, to the danger that was not yet past. "We have to move. Fire's too close." "I can't walk." Marlowe's voice was weak, her face gray beneath the sweat and soot. Blood soaked the blankets beneath her, more than there should be, more than was safe. Thatcher's stomach dropped. He had seen this before, with Anne. Hemorrhage. Death following birth like a shadow. "Rosie, take the baby. Wrap her tight and keep her warm." He scooped Marlowe into his arms, blankets and all, ignoring the screaming protest from his back. He had carried injured calves farther than this. He had hauled fence posts and hay bales, and done work that would break weaker men. He could do this. He had to. He kicked open the barn door and stepped into hell. The world outside had become orange and black, a nightmare landscape of fire and smoke and ash falling like snow. The main house was gone, consumed by flames that shot 50 feet into the air. The kitchen, where Marlowe had cooked so many meals, was a heap of burning timber. The bunkhouse had collapsed into itself, nothing but a skeleton of flames. Everything Thatcher had built over 12 years was burning. But he did not look back. Only one direction was safe: Willow Creek, a quarter-mile east through burning grass and choking smoke. Thatcher ran. His lungs burned with every breath, sucking in smoke and heat. His vision blurred from the tears that streamed from his eyes, part smoke, part terror, part overwhelming determination. Marlowe's weight in his arms was nothing compared to the fear that drove him forward. He could hear Marlowe whispering to the baby, could hear the infant's thin cries, and he used those sounds to orient himself when the smoke grew so thick he could see nothing, could only move forward on instinct and faith. A fence loomed out of the smoke ahead, already burning, flames running along the rails like water. Thatcher did not slow. He lowered his shoulder and crashed through, wood splintering around him, flames licking at his arms and back. Pain flared, bright and sharp, but he ignored it, pushed through, kept running. Marlowe cried out as embers landed on the blanket protecting her and the baby, and he pulled them closer to his chest, shielding them with his body. The ground beneath his boots changed from dry grass to mud. The creek. He stumbled down the bank and waded in, going deep enough that the water reached his waist. The cold was a shock after the searing heat, but it was life, it was safety, it was everything. He found a boulder in the middle of the stream and settled Marlowe against it, where the water ran fastest and the smoke thinned just enough to breathe. Rosie waded in behind them, the baby clutched to her chest, and together they huddled in the creek while the world burned around them. Thatcher soaked a blanket in the creek water and draped it over all of them, creating a tent of wet wool that kept the worst of the smoke away. Then he held Marlowe close, one hand pressed against her belly to slow the bleeding, and waited for the fire to pass. The fire took 3 hours to burn itself out. 3 hours of sitting in cold water while heat raged overhead. 3 hours of holding Marlowe while she grew weaker, her face paling, her breathing growing shallow. 3 hours of listening to the baby cry, first with strength and fury, then more weakly as exhaustion and cold took their toll. Thatcher pressed his hand against Marlowe's abdomen, maintaining steady pressure the way he had once seen a doctor do for a mare hemorrhaging after a difficult birth. It might slow the bleeding, might buy time until help could arrive. If help could arrive. "Talk to me," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Stay awake, Marlowe. Tell me about the baby. Tell me about her name." Marlowe's eyes fluttered open. She looked down at the tiny face pressed against her chest, the baby now quiet and exhausted, breathing, but barely. "Ember," she whispered. "Her name is Ember." "Ember? Born from fire. Survived it." Her voice was so weak, Thatcher had to lean close to hear. "She'll carry that strength all her life. Will remember where she came from." "She'll remember her mother's courage," Thatcher said fiercely. "The woman who walked 300 miles, pregnant and alone, who cooked in a fire-stricken camp, who brought her into the world in a burning barn and lived to hold her. That's what she'll remember." Marlowe smiled, faint and flickering as candlelight. "Promise me." "Promise you what?" "That you'll tell her, tell Ember, who her mother was, what I tried to be." Her eyes were closing again. "Promise." "No," Thatcher's voice cracked. "No. You're going to tell her yourself. You hear me? You're going to live through this and raise her and tell her yourself when she's old enough to understand." But Marlowe's eyes had closed, and her breathing had grown so shallow he could barely see her chest move. "Please," he whispered into her hair, "please don't leave. Don't leave her. Don't leave me." The water rushed around them. The fire roared overhead. And Thatcher Kincaid, who had not prayed in 5 years, prayed with everything he had. Dawn came slowly, gray and smoke-hazed, the sun struggling to pierce through the pall that hung over the valley. The fire had burned itself out, having consumed everything combustible in its path, and finding nothing left to feed on. What remained was devastation, blackened earth, smoking ruins, the skeletons of buildings that had stood for a decade, reduced to ash and memory. But in the creek, 4 souls had survived the night. Thatcher heard the wagon before he saw it, the rattle of wheels on stone carrying clear in the morning stillness. Then voices, calling his name. "Here!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "In the creek! We're here!" People appeared on the bank, faces he recognized from town, the shopkeeper, the blacksmith, families who had come at first light to see what could be salvaged. And Dr. Minerva Hayes, climbing down from the first wagon with her medical bag in hand, her face set in grim determination. She was 55 years old, gray-haired and iron-willed, and she had delivered more babies than anyone in the territory could count. She waded into the creek without hesitation, not caring that her skirts were soaked, and knelt beside Marlowe. One look was enough. "Get her out of the water, now, somewhere dry and warm." Willing hands helped. They carried Marlowe to the stone barn, the only building still standing, and laid her on a bed of clean blankets while Dr. Hayes worked. The doctor's examination was swift and thorough. She felt Marlowe's pulse, weak but present, checked her breathing, shallow but steady. Then she examined the bleeding, her face growing grimmer. "She's lost a lot of blood," Dr. Hayes said, "but the bleeding's slowing. She might make it if we can keep her warm and get fluids into her." Thatcher's legs nearly gave out with relief. "The baby?" Dr. Hayes took Ember from Rosie's arms and examined her with gentle, experienced hands. The infant was cold and exhausted, but her color was good, her breathing steady, her limbs moving with normal vigor. "Underweight, probably premature by a few weeks, but healthy," the doctor pronounced. "She's a fighter, this one. Takes after her mother." She handed Ember back to Rosie and turned to Thatcher, really seeing him for the first time. His arms were burned from crashing through the fence. His face was blackened with soot. His eyes were red from smoke and tears. He looked like he had been to hell and dragged 2 souls back with him, which, Dr. Hayes supposed, was exactly what he had done. "You did good," she said quietly. "Most men would have panicked. You saved them both." Thatcher shook his head. "Marlowe saved herself. I just kept her from drowning." "That's more than most would do." Dr. Hayes gripped his shoulder. "Now sit down before you fall down. I need to look at those burns." Over the next 3 days, the people of Copper Ridge proved that communities could change, could grow, could be better than their worst moments. They came with wagons full of lumber, food, blankets, clothes, tools. They came with money, small amounts from families who had little, but given freely. They came with hands willing to work, and hearts open to helping. They set up a tent camp near the stone barn, fed the ranch hands who had lost their bunkhouse, cared for the animals that had survived, and began immediately to plan for rebuilding.